in geography, because he realized that geography is superior at that point. It took a while for you to realize that, Nicholas, but you got there eventually. So Nicholas is going to talk to us today about putting people in the Earth system. And if anyone is interested, obviously, he is now on campus. Delighted that he could actually go to a live event with real people in a room. I said the last one of these we had was a super spreader event because the next day I got COVID, but never mind, we're all here. So we're very happy to have Nicholas here, and take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks everyone for coming out today. I'm just gonna get right into it. The central question that informs all of my research is how do human societies both contribute to and respond to abrupt environmental change, both in the past and the present. So if you look back into the full span of the archaeological record, we see just myriad cases of the collapse of complex societies, whether it be from external shocks like climate change, pandemics, warfare, or internal strife such as wealth inequality. It's very easy to see these cases when you look back in time, and they're very vivid in the popular imagination. But likewise, if you look in the archaeological record, you see just as many cases of resilience. So even in what you would probably assume is a just cut and dry example of societal collapse in the Maya region, the Maya civilization lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. You can still go to Guatemala today, or to LA for that matter, and find people who speak Maya. So what does that mean? Did they really collapse, or is there something that we can learn from that kind of adaptation and transformation? And this is particularly relevant to me because I always like to start my talks with these two pictures. So here on the left are projections of extreme hot and cold days over the next 100 years. And on the right are estimates of population density based on nighttime lights. And most of my work, kind of informed as my training as an archaeologist, is how do we move from one image to another? That is, if we know something about the spatial pattern of climate change in the past, present, or future, what can that tell us about the spatial configuration and the response of human societies, and vice versa? And archaeological data and also natural history collections more broadly are just a tremendous resource for this kind of work. So not just archaeological data, which are the material remains of past networks of exchange and interaction, but also paleo-environmental and paleo-ecological archives give us a much wider span of evidence about how these changes occurred in the past. They give us a long-term view that you really just can't get from focusing on a narrow range of the last 20 to 50 years on the present day. And the problem isn't the lack of data. So museums are full of just hundreds of thousands of specimens, of potsherds, of seed pods, of anything from an archaeological site. The problem with using this data isn't that we don't have it, it's that it's complex. It's that they're noisy, biased, time and spatially average records of a real world complex system. And so it's really difficult to make accurate inferences from them. And the solution to that problem, going back to this map, is to think not of human societies like this on the right, just dots on a map, but instead as a complex system. That is a network of exchange and interaction that's enabling continuous flows of matter, information, and energy, just in the same way that your circulatory or nervous system enables flows through your body. You're not just an individual, you are a collective. And so by thinking of society as a complex system that's continually acting and interacting with its environment, we can pave the way to these more nuanced analyses. And so the solution to the complexity of the data is to use computers, is to model, is to build models, statistical, computational, and mathematical, of how matter, information, and energy flow in these systems. So today I'm going to focus on two illustrative archaeological case studies. So on the left here, we have Roman North Africa. So if you're familiar, this is Tunisia and Algeria there. And on the right, we have the Southwest US. So that's the states of Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona. And these are great comparative case studies, first of all, because they fall on the same latitudes. They have very similar climatic constraints. And we also have very similar high quality data, this kind of dots on the map approach. So we know where people lived in the past, basically because it's super dry and no one's lived there since. So no one has built cities over where archaeological sites are. So it's not like coming to a densely vegetated place like Florida, where everything that happened in the past is buried under meters and meters of sediment. But there are some differences in these case studies, so try to tackle them using different modeling techniques. So first, in the Southwest case study, we focus on top-down, so statistical models using paleoclimatological and social network data based on archaeological sites. And from the North Africa case study, we have much fewer of this kind of high-quality paleoclimate data. We do have a lot of really good historical and literary records. And so in that case, we investigate small-scale processes from the bottom up using simulation rather than statistical models. So I'm going to discuss these case studies, kind of compare and contrast them, and then show how we can integrate them into a unified modeling pipeline to apply these kinds of complex systems analyses to archaeological or paleoecological data from anywhere in the world. So just moving quickly to our first case study is looking at the interaction between droughts and floods and social networks in the American Southwest. And we're specifically focusing on this period from roughly 1200 AD to 1450 AD. So this is a time of just massive societal collapse, you could call it, migration and social transformation from these sites up here in the Four Corners region down south into what's now the Phoenix Basin. And this happens at around the same time as the most intense mega drought in the last 1,000 years. And so there's obviously some implication, some role of climate in this massive societal shift. And we want to look at a more detailed level, just beyond this dots on a map approach. So we know people moved where they were living. We know that society, quote unquote, collapsed up in the north, but we actually want to understand what was going on under the hood. So again, we're working now from the left to the right in this image. So we're thinking if we know something about the spatial pattern of climate change, how can we use that to infer the societal responses to that? And so we're using an idea that's been really common in anthropology and archaeology, especially in this region, which is basically using stable patterns of climate variability to infer something about how past societies manage risks through their social networks. The basic idea is pretty intuitive, that if you are subject to year-to-year variability in rainfall, you want to maintain social relationships with people who tend not to experience the same weather as you. So if you have a drought, they're having flood events and vice versa. And that allows you both to know what conditions are going on, know whether you want to migrate, know whether you want to pull in resources through trade. And just in general, over long time spans, there's this anthropological expectation that our social networks will configure and reform to match long-term patterns of climate variability. So you can look at this as some observational data from the present day. And this is a moisture index, which is basically telling us how unusually dry or wet a given year is relative to its long-term average. And so you can immediately see, even though there's all of this pixel level variability, there's also a lot of robust patterns that emerge. There's lots of pairs of pixels that tend to be unusually wet or unusually dry at the same time. And so the goal of this case study is to extract those patterns and compare them to some archaeological data sets. So use a standard tool from climate sciences called empirical orthogonal functions. If you're familiar with principal components analysis, it's basically the same thing. And it basically involves taking some stack of space-time data. So here, just as an illustration, we have sea surface temperatures in the Pacific from year to year. You can see, again, there's all this variability, but there's also a lot of patterning in that. So just as an example, if you apply this empirical orthogonal function analysis to this stack of sea surface temperature data, it extracts El Nino, the leading pattern or the mode of variability in Pacific sea surface temperatures. So we can apply this same method to that data set of droughts and floods in the Southwest, and we get this result. We get 6 leading patterns of variability that explain about 80 to 90% of all of the year-to-year summertime precipitation variability in the Southwest. And these have pretty reasonable interpretations related to just the configuration of the continents and the oceans and how moisture is transported. So just as an illustrative example here, this EOF1 pattern represents droughts or floods that are caused by unusual moisture patterns coming from the tropical Pacific. So you can actually picture air masses moving from the Southwest here and interacting with the mountainous environment here. And so likewise, EOF2 is related to air masses coming from the Gulf of Mexico. And so I need pretty clear interpretation for the other patterns. EOF6 here is dealing with air masses that are evaporating and reprecipitating on the Colorado Plateau. So in any given year, you can understand the complex drought pattern by some combination of these patterns. So they'll change in relative importance from year to year, but these patterns don't actually change because they reflect the basic topography and position of the oceans. So you can take these patterns and then compare them to some archaeological data. Specifically, use this data set called the Southwest Social Networks Project. This fantastic team out of Tucson basically went through every single known archaeological site west of the Continental Divide in this region. Several hundred sites. They went through all of the literature and recorded all of the ceramic artifacts from those locations. So several million artifacts in total. And they recorded all this information for every single site in the database. And you can use these data to infer the latent social networks of exchange interaction that gave rise to this variability in artifacts across the landscape. So specifically, you can look at what we call decorated wares. So these are nice pieces of pottery, often painted, that have some clear social significance. And the way you do it is basically imagine if you're trying to look at the intensity of interaction between any pair of sites. Imagine taking a big pile of all the pottery from a site, putting it on the ground, and you want to measure what we call basically the information content of that pile of pottery. And we actually use this real measure. This is the entropy. This is the Shannon information. So we're actually looking at how many different pieces of unique pottery are there in a given site, and what is that distribution. So for example, if a site had all different types of pottery in totally even amounts, exactly like the background distribution of pottery across the entire landscape, that's very low information, right? You wouldn't be surprised by finding all types of pottery at a site. But if you find one site that has all of a single type of very specific type of treated pottery and nothing of anything else, that's a really unusual signal. So you'd be surprised to find that. And so we say that has a high information content. And so what you can do is you can measure the information content of different piles of ceramics from different sites. And you can look at the similarity or the differences between the two distributions. And you get this measure called the Shannon divergence. This is basically stolen from population genetics. So it's the same thing you do to infer gene flow between two different animal populations. And instead of looking at genes, we're thinking more of social genes. We're looking at these artistic characters, basically. And you can interpret it much in the same way as gene flow. So it's not necessarily a direct proxy for migration or trade. It's this larger just trend of social interaction. So it could be people physically taking the pots, moving them from point A to point B. It could also be diffusion of artistic styles. It could be marriage patterns. Everything goes together into this coarse-grained measure. And so when you map these patterns out over time using these decorated ceramics, you get network structures like this. And so these are these 5 different time steps of the data set. And so we can see when you start out in 1200 AD, you have this very stable network pattern. And these clusters you're seeing broadly reflect known cultural or linguistic groups. And you see this pattern more or less continues into 1250 AD. The Great Drought event is at 1275 AD. And then you can see as the network reconfigures, as people are moving further south, the system goes out of equilibrium. So you basically a lot of mixed up ties here. There's no really strong connections. And then as the system reconfigures going into 1400, you see a new social network form focused around the Phoenix Basin here. So then we can interrogate these network patterns using some standard geographical methods. The spatial interaction models, you might have heard of them as gravity models. So we're basically decomposing that network signal into basically push factors, pull factors, and friction factors. So things that make you more likely to want to travel to a location, things that make you more attracted to traveling to a specific location, and then something between those two locations that make it more or less easy to travel. And so just as an example, we can fit some regression models. So this is DIJ. T is that divergence measure. So it's that cultural similarity at a given time point between a pair of sites. And we basically can ask, how does this vary as some unknown function of distance? And then basically some feature of the source of the destination site, some feature of the origin site, and then random noise. So you can fit this simple regression model based on distance, just as an illustration. And then the way we estimate distance is by actually looking at walking time. So in this, we don't have wheeled carts, we don't have automotives, you have to physically travel between a pair of archaeological sites. And so to estimate that, we get this digital elevation model here, and we can estimate how quickly a hiker could move across the landscape. So just to anchor us here, this area in the top left here is the Grand Canyon. So you can see it's really slow hiking around the Grand Canyon, less so down in the lower desert. And so we can use this measure to look at how long it would take a hiker to travel between archaeological sites, apply that regression model, and we get this really nice function that describes how social interaction decays with distance. Now, this is really exciting for me because this is completely estimated from the data. So there's no exponential function that I force the data to conform to. This is the signal that's directly in that artifact data showing this isolation by distance. So now we can use this to basically factor out the role of distance. So look for pairs of sites that interact more strongly than you'd expect just by distance alone. So we can refit that regression model and now add in a new term that is some function of the similarity or dissimilarity in these climate patterns. So we're asking, are two sites that experience different drought and flood patterns more likely to interact with each other than by distance alone? And the answer is yes. So looking at this plot here, the columns are each of the time steps in the data set. The rows are each of these spatial climate patterns. And this line going up here means that as two sites are more dissimilar with respect to that specific pattern, there's stronger interaction. There's greater trade and greater migration between those two locations. And so what you can see here is that in the 1200 AD time step, in the systems at equilibrium, you have this tropical Pacific pattern is very strongly expressed, as are these other Pacific influences. But as the system is shocked out of equilibrium with the Great Drought, this 1300 period, there are no relationships to climate. So everyone is moving across the landscape. These networks are breaking down. And then you can see as it reconfigures in the final time steps, this Gulf of Mexico pattern becomes predominant. And sure enough, if you actually ask archaeologists who work in this region, in this kind of pottery, these connections are associated with a new religious movement that is very strongly influenced by rain and trying to get it to rain more. And it's related to these storms coming from the Gulf of Mexico. So again, the big focus of my work is not just doing these kinds of analyses, but making them easy for other people to do. So I have this R package in development right now called Tidy EOF, which is basically a way for anybody to do this kind of pattern extraction, looking at patterns in climate data and using it to, in this case, downscale. So to go from, for example, large scale reconstructions or climate models to fine scale, regional scales that are more relevant to people to replicate these kinds of analyses in the future. So again, that was this top-down statistical approach. Now we're moving across the ocean to North Africa to look at a bottom-up approach where we're using agent-based modeling or multi-agent simulations to simulate human environmental interactions at a much smaller scale. So now we're moving from the right to the left. We're looking at society as a complex system, and we're seeing how that system impacts the environment. And the primary means through which we interact with the environment, especially in the pre-industrial period, is through land use, is through deforestation or irrigation, anything that we do to produce fuel and food. I actually have a recent paper out that mapped this land use across the globe for the last 12,000 years. And we found that there really is no such thing as unused wilderness, unless you're talking about Antarctica or Sahara or places where people haven't been able to live forever. But most places on the earth have been modified by people in this way at some point. Even the densest parts of the Amazon have long-term influences of human habitation. The problem is when you try to actually model this in the past, for example, to input this kind of data into a climate model or paleoclimate model to understand what the impact of this transformation is, it gets really hard. So most of the standard models that you use to impute into this are so-called hindcasting models. So you take present day maps of where people live and farm, and you basically tie them to present populations, and you push that in the past. You assume there are fewer people in the past, so there's less farming, and that's it. And the problem with that is that there's just an incredible amount of uncertainty. So these are two reconstructions for the same time period, which do not agree. And you also have really clear artifacts. Again, you use present day administrative boundaries I don't show it here, but if you look at these maps of the United States and Canada, you can see the border between the countries 7,000 years ago. So they're really highly dependent on present day data. So those kind of statistical models that I showed you before don't really work here very well. And that's why I think North Africa is a really great illustration of this, because you can't just look at where people are farming today and try to push that back into the past. So right now, if you go to North Africa, it's dry desert, except for this narrow coastal strip where it's still pretty green. In the past, it wasn't like that, as far as we know. During the Roman Empire, it was the main breadbasket of the empire. Something like half of the bread consumed in Rome was grown in North Africa and shipped overseas. So the question that has long challenged archaeologists is why? How is this possible? Was it just that it was wetter in the past than it is now? Or was this some purposeful niche construction by the Romans, extending out hydraulic infrastructure into the desert? And we know for a fact something did change, because you can go out into Sahara right now and find Roman fields and Roman orchards in the sand. So something was changing in the past. But you really can't get these dynamics just by hindcasting from present day data. You actually have to simulate it from the bottom up. So to do that, I use a method called agent-based modeling. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's basically a way of simulating complex systems by breaking them down into their constituent parts. They're looking at the emergent properties that occur when you basically throw them all together in a computer. You look for very simple rules or algorithms that when they interact with one another lead to complex results. So as I said before, we don't really have the kind of high quality data you'd have to make a model of farmers in the present that you use for the present day. So instead, you really have to go back to some first principles of human behavior and demography. And so the simulations I use are really based on three basic assumptions. So one is that human societies are hierarchically organized. So we can have individual farmers who are nested in households, and those households are nested in settlements, and that different kinds of processes occur on different scales. So birth and death, basic demographic aspects happen on the individual scale. Land use decision, food production and consumption decisions happen on the household scale. And then large scale trade and migration happen on the settlement scale. And so you can use this hierarchical organization as a modeling shortcut. So you don't have to model trade and migration on the individual level when it can be more readily modeled on the settlement level. You don't have to model individual farmers' decisions about what to eat when you can do that on the household level. And so you can use this as a shortcut to model populations of millions and millions of people very computationally efficiently. The second assumption is that what we think of as carrying capacity, so the maximum number of people a given landscape can support, isn't just some fixed external factor of the climate, but rather it's an emergent property of the interaction between climate, technology, and culture. So that people don't just move into a landscape and farm wherever it's raining, but they invest in infrastructure and roads and bridges and canals to move resources to different locations. And so that you can't just have some fixed external population level, you actually have to model individual feedbacks between food production, consumption, and labor to look at large-scale population change. And the final assumption is that population dynamics are age-structured and food-limited. This basically gets this essential feedback between the amount of food available to a society and how quickly it grows. The problem is that the amount of food available to a society reflects how many people there are to grow food. And so you have this tension between how many mouths there are to feed and how many people are available to feed them. So looking at the age structure, so that is the distribution of people of different ages in a society, becomes really important for understanding how it's going to evolve and change. So you can throw all these assumptions together in some demographic simulations, and you get really interesting emergent dynamics from that. So here's just an example simulation. We start with a population of 15, 25-year-olds. And so this is the distribution of ages in our simulation. And this is that ratio between food producers and consumers. So right now it's really low. So you have a lot of young people who are able to produce a lot of food with relatively low caloric needs. And as you run that simulation in time, you can see how that dependency ratio oscillates as this population approaches the equilibrium at the very end there. And so even these very simple assumptions can lead to quite interesting dynamics. And this is really important for capturing how a society will organically respond to external shocks. So imagine how society will respond differently to an epidemic disease versus warfare versus a drought that selectively targets different age classes in the population. And you can see here with these oscillations how some kind of demographic shock, like a war in 1 year, can affect the population for hundreds of years to come. So these quite complex emergent dynamics can come from these very simple assumptions, but they're very important for actually modeling these populations realistically. So again, we can throw this all together and we can imagine this simple context of what is the maximum agricultural carrying capacity in Roman North Africa. That is, what if we imagine all of the land that can be farmed is farmed? How many people could it support? And we can use these simulations to look at counterfactual experiments. So this is our Roman North Africa. We've divided the landscape into these little hexagonal grid cells, and we can see each point on the landscape with those 15, 25-year-olds and let the populations grow and look at the equilibrium population levels. So just as an initial experiment, we can use present day climate and no irrigation infrastructure. So people are just growing as much food as the climate can support. And we can see what happens if we keep the rainfall fixed, but we change that infrastructure. So we allow people to build infrastructure. The population grows 2.6 to 2.8, but the spatial distribution doesn't change. So people are growing more where there already is a lot of rainfall, and they're just more efficiently harvesting it. But when you feed in retrodictive climate data from a climate model representing around 200 AD, so the height of the Roman Empire in the area, we see a dramatic shift in the spatial distribution of population. So no longer people just in the narrow coastal plain here, but they're also living in the high Atlas mountains and these large-scale plains out here, and the population is quite a bit higher. And sure enough, when you compare these simulations to archaeological data, that's exactly what you see. So the Roman period is characterized by quite a bit of dense settlement in the plains here that are currently much more sparsely inhabited. So that's some provisional support for these really basic simulations that have these very general assumptions of human behavior, can quite accurately reconstruct these large-scale demographic histories. So again, how can you do this kind of work? All of these algorithms are packaged together in our package. I call it Sylvanus, it's the Roman god of land use, essentially. And the whole idea is that nothing in here is specific to Rome or the Romans. These are all very general, simple algorithms that you can make culturally specific just by feeding in different parameters. So tuning different dials, basically, before you run the simulation. And it's a quite general approach. And so finally, I just want to show how we can integrate these top-down and bottom-up modeling approaches with data to actually learn something about the past from these more limited natural history collections. So again, we picked these case studies because the archaeological site data is unusually good. We know where everybody was at a given time. But that's not the case for most of human history. In most times and places, past populations are covered by present populations. So you can't just assume you have full coverage of a given landscape. And so the solution to this, basically borrowing from a lot of other fields that deal with similar problems, is data assimilation. And so data assimilation is a class of Bayesian methods for fusing models and data to understand something about an imperfectly observed complex system. So imperfectly observed in the sense that we have all these populations growing and varying across space, but you're only looking at them through 1 or 3 archaeological sites that maybe really weren't excavated that well, or someone only looked at a certain area of interest and threw out everything else. So how do you make inferences about this complex whole from very limited, narrow windows? So this is a challenge shared by quite a few other fields. So this data assimilation approach is used quite a bit in crop modeling, for example, where you basically use some kind of simulation model to simulate an ensemble of many thousands of possible realities. And then you can compare those to your real data sets and merge the two together. So you can use all of the information in your model and use it to optimally interpolate your limited observations of the real world. It's also used a lot in epidemic modeling, especially recently with COVID. Again, you're imperfectly observing this complex system, this disease spread with limited testing, and there's all these errors and issues with testing. So you can use data assimilation to make these more robust inferences. And then more closely to my heart, you use this quite a bit in meteorology and climate science, where you run a weather model, hundreds of times to predict how the next week of weather is going to go. And you can update it each successive day when you see what the weather was, instead of having to rerun the simulation all the time. So it's a very efficient way of merging the information that we encode in our models with the information from the real world. And so building on this approach, so these are all focused on forecasting. So our uncertainty about the world is related to not knowing the current state of the world. So we use our simulations to model several different possible futures. What we need to use for archaeology and paleoclimatology is the different problem, is looking at how the system could have evolved given known constraints. So this is the idea closer to hindcasting instead. And so we can basically steal the approach that paleoclimatologists have already developed for this, hindcasting using these kinds of data assimilation approaches. So basically what you do in this approach is you use a climate model, general circulation model, Earth system model to embed all of your scientific knowledge. So you run a climate model thousands of times, and it can tell you what are all the possible states of the climate system in the past. And then you use the climate model to basically grow your data in the model. So if you're using tree rings for corals or ice cores, you grow a tree ring in the model rather than going the other way around. You can then take these simulated data and compare them to the real data and use the difference between the two to update your knowledge in the model. And what's so elegant about this is that by simulating the data within the model, you're able to capture all the uncertainty. So all the issues with sparsity and noise and bias in your data set are able to be directly estimated through this kind of approach. And so the idea is using these modeling approaches that I presented already in lieu of those kinds of climate models. How can we use these simulations of past populations to generate these flexible null models of different demographic histories in the past? So what if all you have is, say, a digital elevation model, a climate model representing some estimate of climate in the past? Can you estimate realistic population and land use patterns from that? And so to do that, this is the third and final R package, I swear. Basically, it's combining a lot of the insights from those other two case studies we saw into a single, more flexible simulation framework. So we're taking this idea of a hexagonally gridded landscape with individual populations from the North Africa case study. These populations are growing and declining based on those demographic features, but now we've connected them and we allow them to trade and migrate between the different cells. And we use the kinds of spatial interaction models from the Southwest case study. Although now, instead of them being these statistical models that we try to estimate with real world data, they're dynamical models. So we could use them to simulate these flows of information, food, and people in our urban systems. And so we can use this as a very flexible approach to apply to anywhere on the planet. And just this is a fun case study. I was playing around with this. So this is this area in the Greek peninsula. And we did that same approach before. We started off with the same amount of people in every grid cell in our landscape. We seeded the land with the kind of realistic climate distribution. So this is based on present day productivity. And we just let the simulation run over time. And we can see what cities and settlements grow and which do not. Then we can take this, which is entirely simulation, no data went into this, and we can compare it to the real world data. There you go. It shows that quite a bit of the variation in these ancient Greek city-states is just arising from very basic geographic and demographic principles. And so the next step is to use this kind of simulation and data assimilation framework with real museum collections. So we have a proposal currently in review with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, where we have just a huge amount of tree samples from the Southwest US and Mexico that have never been analyzed. And so these black dots here, those are all the sites from the data set I analyzed previously. You'll notice they stop at the US-Mexico border. And so if you were to try to just like estimate populations from these known data, you'd have these artificial boundaries at the border. And we have all this undated material in the museum right now, all these red dots. And the idea is to use this data assimilation approach to optimally fuse these models and data. And a really powerful benefit of this technique is that uncertainty analysis I talked about. So you can run this analysis once and say, add the observations from one site, rerun it, and you get a spatially explicit estimate of your uncertainty. So where are we least certain about past populations? And you can use that to inform where the next site you want to look at is. And so you can use this technique to iteratively build your model such that instead of having to go and laboriously record every single sample from every single site, you can find, say, what are the 10 or 100 archaeological sites that we most need to focus our attention on in order to reconstruct these past populations accurately. And then the reason why I'm here is applying the same approach for a museum. So again, we just have a tremendous amount of resources in terms of environmental archaeology, plants in the herbarium, plant samples from past and present, and a huge amount of genomic data as well. And if these same issues, they're really powerful. They give us an amazing view of the past, but they're sparse and noisy. And so how can we want to use this approach to better integrate them to find a more complex whole? Thank you guys for your attention.
Does anyone in the room have any questions to begin with?
Nicholas, could you go into a little bit more detail about the population dynamic equation in North Africa? There were times when certain age groups would differentially drop faster than other age groups as they aged, and there was a lot of interesting detail in there. Yeah,
It's random.
yeah, that's just randomness.
And that's what's the strength of it. So you could run very similar models. So ecologists do this all the time with matrix models. They're called like Leslie matrices. So it's the same way of doing these age-structured population dynamics. But those are deterministic. So you only ever get one result from that.
Right.
But the real world is effectively random. And that's why this ages-based approach is so useful, because like if a single house doesn't get enough food, everyone in the house dies off. Right?
So what are you randomizing? Randomizing the age structure, or I'm not Leslie models. I know Leslie. So you have the age and the product in the fecundity at every age step. What gets randomized?
So in this case, it's the actually giving birth. So it's like you're drawing a binomial Poisson distribution.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's essentially a stochastic Leslie matrix. But this age-based approach gives you a lot more of this variability, and so you can understand how the population is sensitive at very small levels.
Yeah.
And the other, with Leslie matrices, the population can't really die out very easily.
Right.
And here it can.
So in these drylands, foraging is a very important lifestyle.
Mhm.
How do you build farming versus foraging?
Yeah. See, here I go.
Because farming is a relatively new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas most societies are foraging societies.
Yeah. So here, yeah, this is mostly focused on agrarian societies because of that. And in these cases, you actually be surprised. You look at some of the primary literature that the majority, like 90% of their calories are coming from grains. Like they're very unhealthy. There has been some work in the Four Corners region and around Mesa Verde of actually incorporating that. So allowing people to hunt for, I think it's deer and turkey. And so how does that affect these population dynamics if you vary the relative contribution of meats to grains in the diet? So you can get those kinds of sensitivities from that.
I think like pine nuts and
Yes.
tubers.
And at the end of the day, though, it's a lot of these, it's calories in, calories out, right? And so some of these meat sources are more calorically dense, but you have to expend a lot more resources to forage. And those models are actually very common. The whole human behavioral ecology literature is focused on that. And so my goal with this is to try to push these methods into agricultural societies, where people are usually much more treating these from the economics perspective rather than the ecological perspective.
You do all of your AVM work in R?
Yeah. I used to do it in NetLogo. I found it's a lot easier to develop in R because you can plot stuff in real time. So you can like have your analysis, however you're going to analyze the results, in line with the code in your notebook as you're running the model. And so it makes development a lot easier.
I asked very selfishly because I want you to come and guest lecture in my spatial. So we'll use that logo for that specifically.
Yeah, but NetLogo is such a pain to actually load the
It sure
geographic
is.
data in there. And this is like, at least for me, like I'm already processing the geographic and climate data in R already. So it just makes a lot more sense to do it that way.
About the Baker's question about the population structure, is that model take into account at all that life expectancy back then was a lot shorter, so you wouldn't people aren't living the ages that they are now. And also I was curious about this kind of societies are hierarchical, like you said, but just because food is produced doesn't mean that everyone can get it or has access to it. So how that plays in.
Sure.
So,
So just going to the first one first. So that's that urban hinterland model. That's part of that. So those little dots that are growing and shrinking, that's right here. This is the urban population. They're not producing food. So they're getting food that they're basically absorbing food from the hinterlands. I think, let's see, I have so it's this. So basically you're getting, so you have variable resource production. There's flows of food into the cities. The urban population is using that surplus. And then you also have then the separate population flows. And so, that's where you can get a lot of interesting, like the political and the governance structures actually determining how that surplus is distributed amongst the population. And then what was your first question again?
the population structure as far as life expectancy is being so vastly different from 1,000 years ago today.
Well, that's the interesting, like what's the intrinsic life expectancy versus the realized life expectancy. And so the intrinsic life expectancy, so how long would you live if you had all of the food available to you and no threats? We're getting that from, there's some really interesting census data from Roman Egypt, where the life tables, just like you'd see today. But then the realized life expectancy is limited by food. And so you have these specific functions that tell you for a given age and a given level of caloric deficit, how much does that decrease your life expectancy? And so usually you can get the low life expectancies that we see in the past are all because of those caloric restrictions and climatic variability. But the intrinsic life expectancy is more or less stable. I mean, people still live to be 70 or 80. In the past, it was just much less common.
Johanna, do you have a question?
I do. Hello, everyone. Or actually, not so much a question, more of a comment. I just want to say thank you for a really nice presentation. And I was actually in Sahara about 15 years ago, but the course was in geomorphology. So we saw these ruins and they just said, yeah, the Romans were here. And that was basically it. So I just wanted to say it was really interesting to see your presentation and learn more about that and learn that someone actually has studied that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, really interesting building on that. I mean, if you go to these locations in Tunisia, especially today, the Berbers are still there. The Berbers were there before the Romans came. All of that irrigation infrastructure is Berber technology that the Romans co-opted. And so they're like some of those water features, this like runoff harvesting, people are using it today is what they were using thousands of years ago.
Any other questions?
You obviously talked a lot about the past, so I'm going to ask a question maybe you get often too, but what type of insights can you gain from this in thinking about climatic changes now moving into the future and how interconnected the world is and society is in thinking about just, I guess, tipping points for different changes in how society is structured and where we live?
Yeah. I think the big point that I always hammer home is the importance of timescales. Like, and if you're looking at a present day study of migration, long-term study of migration, that's like 10, 25, 50 years, you'd be like really ecstatic to have that kind of data, right? Like 50-year like panel data for that would be amazing. But if you look at the that migration example, those time sets were 50 years, and those population responses were happening over centuries. And so just kind of appreciating how quickly everything has changed. Like 100, 150 years ago, industrial revolution, everything was very different. Like we are not at equilibrium right now. We are still responding from this change in energy production that has exploded our population. And so just recognizing how quickly things are changing, how quickly things can change is really important. I mean, we're looking at timescales on thousands of years that these dynamics occur on. And so how would you be able to see them right now as they're happening? Like, you can't. And so that's why it's so important to actually look back into the past, just to understand what can change on these timescales.
Well, today in my sea level rise class, I taught them that, we're committed to sea level rise for centuries, millennia now. So, the long-term timescales are important.
One takeaway is that you want to have friends in places that climate's doing something the opposite of what you're doing.
This is something I thought a lot
Diversify
about.
your portfolio.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this living in Tucson when it's like if there's some kind of storm or something that knocks out the electric distribution in the summer, no air conditioning, like you will die in a couple hours. And so it's like, where would you go? Right? And everyone else would go to the same place. And so understanding these climate patterns are the same patterns today, so like they haven't changed. Right.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, using those to inform like current day distribution networks is super important.
Yeah.
Are you going to be teaching?
Yes.
What are you going to be teaching?
I was going to teach an agent-based modeling course, but I don't know anymore.
Come teach with me.
So yeah, kind of the two thrusts is again, so it's the bottom up, so it's agent-based modeling, and then I'm really into sort of climate modeling and climate downscaling. So we do a course on that as well. Cool.
Yeah, you should definitely talk to our group. Well, thank you very much for coming and talking to us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the online group. We will see you all next week.